Hello, Dr. DeVore's APUS history classes. This is the second part of the Chapter 1 lecture. And today, we're going to talk about the colonization of the New World. So in the previous lecture, we talked about who was here prior to Europeans coming from the Old World to the New. Now, again, when I say New World, what I'm referring to is the area over in the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, and yes, Central America is not a continent, but I will often say North, Central, and South America to make those differentiations between the regions. So we're going to have people come over from Europe who are going to settle, who are going to then colonize and settle in the New World. And we need to talk about a few things that led to this colonization of the New World. So what do we have that's going to lead to this colonization of the New World? And then what are the motivations for that colonization? Well, over in Europe, there was something going on, and there's going to be a few things going on that are going to facilitate exploration of the New World. One of those is going to be the development of new technologies. There are going to be new sails that develop. The astrolabe is going to be developed, which is a way for sailors to map and chart and get from point A to point B to point C and know what they're doing instead of just sort of like going willy-nilly. So there are going to be technological advancements. There's also political advancements in the New World or in the Old World that are going to take place. For instance, you're going to see a lot of the areas of Europe start to become actual countries. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that Europe prior to this era was a lot of little kingdoms, and those kingdoms would fight with each other all the time. But then you have people start to take these kingdoms and form them into actual countries. So a political revolution of sorts. We call them nation states, but this is what's going to happen with Spain funding Columbus. Spain is really two kingdoms that come together to form Spain. And I'm simplifying this. Obviously, this is not a European history course, but they come together, they form Spain, and then they want to show their power as a nation state. So we're going to talk about that power in a little bit and how that plays into this whole exploration deal. Another thing is going to be the need for resources in countries as they start to develop trade and they want to build things. They're going to need resources. And then another huge factor in all this is a little thing that you hopefully remember from world history, but if not, I don't blame you, the Protestant Reformation. So it is around this time that we start to see Protestantism taking shape in Europe. And what I mean by Protestantism, so there's Catholics and Protestants. They're both Christians, but there is Catholicism and then there's Protestantism. And Protestantism, many of you might be Protestants. If you're a Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or, things like that, you are a Protestant, not a Catholic. Some of you may be Catholics. That's great. Whatever you are, totally awesome. But this does mean that all of a sudden in Europe, the Catholic Church sees a quick decline in membership. They basically lose areas like England and Germany, and these are relatively well-populated regions. So the Catholic Church is going to want to go out and expand and find more people to bring into the Catholic Church. So part of what's going to happen here is there's going to be a religious motivation. They have the ability through technological motivations. They have the funding and the want for power and glory through the coming of these nation states. And then they have a motivation, which is the converting of people to Catholicism. Because the main country that's going to settle early on in the New World is going to be Spain, and the Spanish are Catholics. By this point, they had driven out the Moors being Muslims, etc. So when we talk about the exploration of the New World, what we really are talking about is the Old World growing up and wanting to go and expand. And there is, and this is, again, much of this is a simplification, but we don't need to get too far into the nuance of this exploration and the conquistadors and all the super tiny motivational factors. Everyone had their little different reasons and things like that. But we could generalize it with what are known as the 3 G's: God, glory, and gold. And you see these over here, right? God, glory, and gold. So I've already sort of alluded to the God aspect of this. The God aspect of this is we are going to convert the native population to Christianity. Now, one of the things that's going to differentiate Spanish conquest versus English conquest is that the English are not necessarily going to try to convert the native population, but the Spanish are. And I don't mean convert in the sense that you might think about it in the 21st century or late 20th century of you're going to sit there and you're going to like teach them the Bible and you're going to try to teach them the workings of the Catholic Church. A lot of the conversion for the Catholic Church and these conquistadors that come over is going to be saying, hey, you used to worship this God, now you worship this God, you are all Catholics. One of the crazy things about the conquistadors when they come over is they are going to read this document called the Requirimiento to the people they conquer. And this document is basically saying, we have come here to save you and civilize you and turn you into good Catholics. The problem is that they read it in Latin. And even if they read it in Spanish, the people living in the New World didn't understand Spanish, and they certainly didn't understand Latin. The conquistadors didn't really understand Latin. The people that would read it would be priests that spoke or could read Latin. And so this was a way for them to justify the conquest of the New World. We're doing it to civilize you and, turn you on to God and to give you to the Catholic Church. So that's the God part, right? So God, glory, and gold. Well, the glory comes from power and status, but not only power and status from a national standpoint, that is certainly part of it. Nations like Spain and Portugal are going to be two of the biggest explorers and conquerors in this period. And they're going to be two very powerful nations. And yes, taking these lands are going to make them even more powerful. But there's also individual glory, right? Most of the conquistadors that come over, some of them are failures back at home, but certainly the people underneath. So like the people underneath Columbus, the people underneath Hernan Cortez, the people underneath Pizarro, many of these were young men or people that didn't have jobs back in Spain or couldn't make a living. And they're coming over to try to find a new world. They want to prove themselves and establish these things. And when they get over here, they're going to get land and they're going to establish new lives. And they're going to get that glory of conquering the new world. So not only does the conquest of the New World bring prestige and power and status to the nations, on a personal level, it can also bring prestige and power there. So we have that going on in the New World as far as it goes with glory. And then the last part, so we got God, the Catholic Church, we got the glory, power, and prestige, and now we have the gold. The gold as well. And there's really two facets here. And this is another area where we are going to have a difference. And I'm setting you up because one of the questions that appears a lot on the AP exam, either in short answer questions, LEQs, or even rarely, not anymore, it won't be in a DBQ because of the periodization, but the question will be compare in some way, shape, or form English colonization to Spanish colonization. And English and Spanish colonization were very, very different. For instance, most of the people that come over from Spain are men, young men. The English will bring over family units. The Spaniards don't do that. And I'll get into that a little bit more here in a minute when I get to the Columbian Exchange. But one of the other differences is that when the Spanish come to the New World, they encounter these massive empires, especially Hernan Cortez, who interacts with the Aztec. And these empires had gold everywhere. They had gold statues and gold plates and everything else. And these conquistadors and people come over, see this, and they go, oh my God, there's lots of wealth here. When the English come over, they don't have that experience. The English, when they come over in 1607, and even before then with the failed colony of Roanoke, they expect to find what the Spaniards had found. They expect to find these civilizations and gold and everything else, but they don't. What they find are more nomadic tribes or nothing at all. Because by the time they get there, smallpox have ravaged the coastlines, and we don't see that same, they don't have the massive kingdoms. They don't have the big cities. It's a completely different indigenous population. But they do find the gold, but it's not just physical gold. It's not just mining for gold. It's also new sources of wealth. They wanted to initially trade with Asia. They think they're going to go to Asia, but then they find ways to trade through to the New World. And they're going to get raw materials for the New World. We're setting up something called mercantilism. And mercantilism is a process by which colonies feed the mother country. So the mother country profits off of its colonies. The colonies provide, and here's how this works. The colonies, mother country goes, conquers an area, it becomes a colony. The colony then provides raw goods to the mother country. The mother country then refines those raw goods and sells them either back to the colonies or to other people, other countries, other regions, or even within the mother country itself. An example of this would be when England would take wood from Maine, Massachusetts, which at the time Maine was part of, England would take wood from Maine, and then that wood would go back to England where they would turn it into furniture, and then England would then turn around and sell that furniture back to people in the colonies. It was illegal for the people in the colonies to make their own furniture. Now, you could make your own furniture for your house, but you couldn't start a company that made it because England would say, no, you have to buy that from us because you're a colony. So gold does not mean just only physical gold. It can also mean gold via trade or gold via this mercantilist system. Please look up the word mercantilism. It is very important for you to know what mercantilism is. And if I say that, that means it's very likely to be on an exam. And in fact, anything you see in red in these exams is very likely to be on the exam. Now, one of the absolutely most important aspects of the conquest of the New World is what we call the Columbian Exchange. Now, notice that's Columbian spelled with a U, like Christopher Columbus, not the country, Colombia. Columbus here. So the arrival of Columbus in 1492 led to massive demographic and social changes in the New and Old World. And let's talk about what this Columbian Exchange is. At its core, the Columbian Exchange is the exchange of people, diseases, food, trade, ideas, etc., between the Old World and the New World and the New World and the Old World. So things from the Eastern Hemisphere, from Europe and Africa, will come over to the New World, and things from the New World will go over to the Old World. And it's going to change human history. It's a massive change in human history. So let's talk about it. Well, what are some of the big things that are going to happen? First of all, horses and cattle. Horses and cattle. So sheep, cattle, horses, pigs, these are all things that did not exist in the New World. They are going to come over when the Europeans bring them over. Now, think about that. The area that we are from, Oklahoma, the area that we live in, Oklahoma and Texas and even Kansas, part of our history is so attached to cattle, to cows and horses. Yet those are things that did not exist in this part of the world until after Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. Also, so you might be like, well, what did they have if they didn't have horses? Well, they had alpacas, and alpacas are like llamas. Not the greatest animal to work with. They can be pretty stubborn. Now, they are great for their fur or their whatever. I don't know if you call it fur, but alpaca wool or whatever. You can make it into clothing. It's very super soft. It's great. But when it came to being a pack animal, like an animal that can plow a field or haul things, they weren't very good. And you might be like, well, what about donkeys and mules? Those are all derivative of horses and things like that that did not exist in the New World until you have those Old World things come over. Now, this is also going to be one of the, it's going to change the game. It's going to change warfare, etc. If we think about horses in the context of the military, one of the other things that the Europeans are going to bring over are guns. Imagine not knowing what a gun is. The people living in the New World had arrows and atlatls. Atlatl is a thing that flings an arrow. It's very deadly, but it's not a gun, right? And so all of a sudden you have people showing up that have these magical tubes of iron and wood that have smoke that comes out the end and can kill someone. You would be flabbergasted if you saw that. You have no idea. And they show up in these big ships that you're like, well, what is this? And what are these guns and cannons and horses? What is going on here? Who are these people? And later we will talk about that a little bit more when I tell you about Hernan Cortez and how he was able to conquer Mexico very quickly. Now, outside of horses, there are also the exchanges of diseases. And the Europeans were relatively dirty, just to be quite honest. And the people in the New World were relatively clean. And so the Europeans brought all these diseases over. They're going to help wipe out the Native American population or / indigenous population in the New World. Again, I said before, that population went anywhere from 90 million to 100 million down to anywhere between 6 to 9 million. So any way you slice it, tens of millions of people died because of these diseases. And what were those diseases? Well, the more minor ones, even though these are horrible diseases: influenza, the flu, typhus, measles. And, we used to have measles wiped out, but then people started not vaccinating, and now measles have come back. Malaria, we have diphtheria, whooping cough, but the big one was smallpox. And I don't recommend looking up smallpox on Google, or at least don't look at the images because they are really, really gross. But smallpox, creates pox on the skin. We currently are dealing with monkeypox. If you're watching this video in the future, maybe monkeypox is gone by now. But, we came out of the pandemic, and think about that pandemic that we were in, the spread of COVID. If you took someone with COVID and put them into a classroom and they started coughing, other people catch COVID. That's exactly what was happening with smallpox. The people living in the New World did not have the antibodies to deal with COVID. Now, if you come into my classroom and you have the flu, I may not catch it because I potentially have antibodies that have built up over years that could keep me from getting the flu. But with COVID, none of us had the antibodies, and so we caught it. So that transmission of these germs to the New World is going to wipe out millions of people. Absolutely millions and millions and millions of people are going to die because of this smallpox epidemic that sweeps across Latin America, and then eventually will make its way up north and start taking out tribes. Smallpox will continue to be a problem throughout the history, well into the existence of the English colonies and beyond, because it's such a communicable, that means easily spread disease amongst humans. Now, this is a part that's a little bit more fun. So far I've talked about, okay, fine, horses and cattle, that's pretty fun. Then I talked about people dying from guns. Then I talked about people dying from disease. Now let's talk about some more fun stuff. If you look up at this chart that's on this slide, this is the Columbian Exchange slide. You'll see this slide or something close to it in any textbook that you're going to use talking about this period. And if you look at it, you can see the things that came from Europe and the things that go to Europe. So let's look at some of the other things that came from Europe, things that you might associate with the Western Hemisphere today: citrus fruits, limes, oranges. We think of citrus fruits and stuff like that coming from Florida and California, but they didn't exist there until they came over from Europe. Coffee beans. Coffee is synonymous with South America. Colombian coffee, Brazilian coffee. That didn't exist. It came from the old world. Onions. So much of what you eat has onions in it. Bananas. Again, we associate bananas with tropical islands. That came over from the old world. Grapes as well. All those grapes that grow out in California and on the West Coast, that's something that comes from the old world. On the other side, we have some very interesting things. Yes, there's stuff like vanilla and beans, peanuts, pineapples, various peppers. The turkey came over. But then there are some bigger ones that really, really matter when we talk about the history of the world. If I was to tell you guys, hey, we're going to go have Italian food tonight, most of you are going to say, well, I don't know how refined of eaters you are, but most of you are going to say, oh, okay, well, spaghetti and meatballs. Or you're going to think of lasagna, or you're going to think of maybe a chicken parmesan or something like that. Most of what you're going to think about is going to have some sort of red tomato-based sauce with it. Well, the reality is tomatoes did not exist in Italy until after Christopher Columbus goes to the New World. Think about that. Italian food until the 1500s, essentially, did not have tomatoes. Today, most Italian food that we consume in the United States, we associate with tomatoes. Now, there are areas, if you go to Italy, that still don't use that many tomatoes. What were those dishes in Italy made of? You might be saying, Dr. DeVore, if they didn't have tomatoes, what were they eating? Well, if you look down here, one of the things that came over from the old world to the new was the olive. And so a lot of dishes in Italy, in that region, were olive oil based, right? They were olive oil based, not based on tomato sauce. Now, the Italians are going to adopt the tomato and they're going to start making their own sauces, and it'll become synonymous with Italian food. But even like I said today, there are a lot of Italian dishes that don't use tomato sauce. And that's a more traditional, even if you want to use the word ancient, Italian dish, because they didn't have tomatoes. Other staples, potatoes. The Germans used tons of potatoes. The Russians used tons of potatoes. And then, super importantly, the Irish use tons of potatoes. The Irish will come to the United States because of a potato famine, because they're going to lose their potatoes. A thing that did not exist prior to Columbus becomes the staple food for an entire area of Europe. That's amazing. That's why this is such a transformative process, because you have this food stuff that didn't exist all of a sudden comes over and becomes one of the most important and prominent foods in Northern Europe, and especially in a place like Ireland. If you eat German food, you're going to have potatoes. If you go to Belgium, you're going to have French fries. They don't call them French fries, they call them frites, I believe, but you're going to have French fries. Potatoes are everywhere. And then on top of that, you have probably this, well, either 1 or 1A, corn. Now, you might be like, why is corn so freaking important? What's the big deal about corn? Well, the original corn that went over, I'm not talking about big ears of yellow corn that's sweet and tasty. Original corn was very small. It kind of looked like those mini corns that you might find on a salad bar, but it was more of a grain. And most of the time over in the New World, that corn would be mashed up and turned into a powder, a cornmeal. You would turn it into tortillas, things like that. But corn in history becomes very, very important for a few reasons. One, people can eat corn. It can be ground into, breads and foodstuffs that way. You can eat corn directly. Two, corn is one of the main sources of feeding cattle. It's a cheap way to feed cows. So you can grow your cows bigger, quicker on corn. And then third, in a modern context, corn is so incredibly important because corn is often used to produce ethanol, but also to produce plastics. There's an estimate that nearly 70 to 75% of the things in a grocery store use corn, even if it's not actually corn, via the packaging or something like that. So corn is of vital importance. And then last but certainly not least, we have the pumpkin. No, I'm kidding. The pumpkin doesn't matter. We eat pumpkins in pie and pumpkin spice things, and we carve them in Halloween. We have tobacco. Now, tobacco is going to be the crop that saves the English colonies in the New World when we get past this Spanish colonization. Tobacco is a great crop to grow because why? It's addictive, right? And so it's an absolutely great crop to grow if you want to make sure that people keep buying it. So that is one of the reasons why tobacco becomes such an important crop for the New World. And people in Europe are going to love it. Now, of course, the indigenous population of Latin America smoked tobacco leaves. And then over time, Americans are going to learn how to refine that tobacco until eventually we get the dried tobacco, loose leaf tobacco, and then eventually we get modern day cigarettes. Now, none of us should be doing tobacco. None of us should be doing nicotine. It's bad for you. But it was a staple crop that helped the English colonies survive. Okay. Well, we went through all of one slide today, but it's probably one of the most important slides in human history because this Columbian Exchange, this exchange of ideas and goods and everything else, and I'm not even done. I forgot this. Before I forget, I told you that all these Spanish conquistadors that came over were just dudes, right? Just men. Do you think a bunch of 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old men that come over to a new world and are told, hey, you're going to be here for a long time, are going to be content to be lonely for several years? Oh, no, you are wrong. So what you have is a lot of those Spaniards begin sleeping with the native population. And then you have the creation of an entirely new, essentially entirely new race of people, people that are of mixed descent from indigenous peoples in the New World and people from Spain. And the Spanish system of race is incredibly complex, and we don't need to get into it. But there was a massive hierarchy of people that came from Spain were at the very top. If you were from Spain but born in the New World, you're next. And then it mattered what your dad was, what your mom was, etc. And we go all the way down the pole. And this is also very important. I'm glad I started talking because I almost forgot. All that smallpox, all these people come over from Europe and they're using the indigenous people to work on their plantations. They're called encomiendas. And encomienda, I'll talk about that a little bit later. But those people start to die from diseases and being overworked. And the conquistadors lose their labor population. So what do they turn to? Slavery, and specifically African slavery. And so this is where we start to see the slave trade of people coming from Africa, going to the New World, and you're introducing another entirely new race into the New World. And then there'll be intermarriage between slaves and indigenous people. There'll be, children produced from white masters and black slaves, and you're going to have all these different racial categories that develop. One thing to remember and to bear in mind, in the New World, slaves were held higher in social status than full-blood indigenous peoples. All right, well, if I haven't driven home how important the Columbian Exchange is, you're going to write about it here in a little bit. So enjoy that. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Be safe and make good decisions.